Welcome, dear students, to the massive open online course on Political Economy 1. In today's module, we are going to talk about European feudalism and the transition to capitalism. The major objectives of this module are as follows. We would like to explore the difference in class relations of England and France before the transition to capitalism. We would like to throw some light on the transition debate and the Dobbs-Sweezy controversy. In fact, we would also like to delve into the nature of the economy in the transition period, and finally, we would like to analyze the emergence and growth of capitalism. Firstly, we would like to focus our attention on the historical basis for the development of capitalism in England. The specific historical basis for the development of capitalism can be traced back to the unique structure of the English manorial lordship. In the absence from English lordship of what we usually call the banal lordship, it's a political form of parcellized sovereignty which was central to the development of the continental feudalism that can be seen to account for the peculiarly economic turn that we observe in the development of the English class relations of surplus extraction. Needless to say, the economic social relations that was necessary for capitalism was forged in this crucible of a peculiarly form of feudal class society in England. Now, if we look at the French connection in this respect, we find that in France, in contrast to what we see in England, that there was a distinctly political tenor of social development, and this can be traced significantly or specifically to the centrality of the banal lordship that I just explained before in the fundamental relations of feudalism. Basically, France boasted of a rise in the absolutist state, of an intensely political character of the social conflict of the revolution, and also it boasted of a massively bureaucratic state. Now, it's very important to really understand the differences that existed between the English and the French type of feudalism. So one thing we can safely conclude that England and France had a distinctively different flavor of feudalism, and the effects from these initial basic differences in the feudal relations between these two countries also include certain other points. Firstly, the unique differentiation of freehold and customary tenures among the English peasants in contrast to the survival of the allodial land in France. Basically, allodial land, it means that there is no sort of ownership for that type of land. Now we find that with the decline of feudalism in France, land that had been under the jurisdiction of a lord came to be under the jurisdiction of the king, who collected certain fees upon its sale or transfer. Now, following the French Revolution of 1789, all land in France became allodial. As I have just said, that land was freely held without obligation of service to anyone or to any overlord. In the context of England, there was no such land which could be referred to as allodial. But basically they were estates, and it simply corresponds in, you just need to pay some type of fee, and that corresponds in practice to basically the concept of absolute ownership. Thirdly, the unique development of the English common law, which was rooted in the concept of land, in contrast to the continental revival of the Roman law, which was based on trade. Then fourthly, we had the unique commoner status of the English manorial lords, in contrast again to the continental nobility. And finally, the unique enclosure movement by which England ceased to be a peasant society. In fact, in England, they even ceased to have peasants before the advent of industrial capitalism, which was in stark contrast to other European societies at that point of time. Now, if we look at the feudal society, if we try to look at the characteristics of the feudal society, the feudal system was primarily based on an agrarian subsistence economy. The manor, which was basically the large tracts of land, they were central to the feudal system, and the manor was basically owned by a feudal lord. Now, who used to cultivate the land? The land was cultivated by the serfs. And serfdom was based on the use of extra economic coercion for controlling the labor, and fate of serf cultivators were decided by the feudal lords. But apart from these secular lords, the clergy or the priestly class, they also owned large tracts of land, and these priestly lords also acted as feudal lords in many cases. So here comes, when I talk about the priestly class, so here comes the concept or the notion of the Catholic Church. The Catholic Church at that time was the largest landlord of medieval Europe. Now, however, we find many towns coexisting with the manors in medieval Europe and representing basically the non-agrarian system of the economy. Now, these towns were involved in manufacturing activities, and the manufacturing in these centers was done by an association of artisans, the craftsmen, and the professionals, and they were called guilds. The guild was responsible for the production and sale of commodities. The quantity and quality to be produced and the price, this was all determined by the guild. We come to the concept of feudal system versus capitalism. In contrast to the feudal system, capitalism is an open, market-oriented economy which are characterized by mass-scale commodity production and has got an extremely high division of labor. So, the products that were produced were not meant for subsistence use. Rather, they were meant to be sold in the markets for gaining profits. The products and services that were exchanged in the markets or through market used money as a medium of exchange. The means of production or the productive assets are privately owned in this system, and the owners of these private assets, they will buy the labor power to use in their production operations, which they will produce for the market, where they'll be selling their products to earn profits for themselves. So, production for profit or accumulation, this is the sole implicit purpose of all production under this system. Capitalism, thus, is the natural output or product of unfettered development, requiring at most the removal of such obstacles as those that were imposed by the feudal system or by feudalism. Here we come to the most important aspect of this module, that is the transition debate. The period of transition is one of the most controversial one, because different scholars have argued on the nature of the process of this transition depending on their varying perspectives. What we now know as the transition debate, the most important amongst them is called the Dobb-Sweezy controversy. This controversy took place in the 50s, and they turned on the correct Marxist explanation of the transition from feudalism to capitalism in the light of the European experience, rather the Western European experience. And the contributions of many noted economists and historians, they all have been moving around the same theme. Now coming to, as I said, the most important one in this transition debate is the Dobb-Sweezy controversy. In 1947, the Marxist economist Maurice Dobb published a book that attempted to outline and explain how the feudalistic economic system of medieval times had given way or made a transition towards capitalism. The name of the book is Studies in Development of Capitalism. This book was published in 1947. This started a debate amongst the economists and the historians over the following decades, and to tell you very frankly, it is continuing till today. The Marxist idea of the mode of production provides a point of departure for Dobbs' analysis. Dobbs argues that the formative impact of feudal surplus extraction relations, which are characterized by extra economic compulsions by the feudal lords in relationship to the potentialities and limits of his peasant forces of production, they determined a distinctive pattern of economic evolution. And Dobbs stressed that the inner contradictions within the feudal mode of production is the cause of its decline. So one thing Dobbs basically had emphasized, that within the feudalistic mode of production, embedded in the internal of its system, lies the reason of the downfall of feudalism. Scholars like Rodney Hilton, Christopher Hill, and others, they strongly supported this view, along with providing detailed explanation for it. Now, feudalism as a stable economy was based on the concept of natural economy, and this was in stark contrast to what we'd call the exchange economy that emerged as a result of trade and commerce. Now, in Dobbs' words, natural economy and exchange economy are two distinctly different economic orders, and they cannot mix amongst themselves, and the presence of the latter, that is the exchange economy, is sufficient to cause the dissolution of the former. The former is the natural economy. Now, the money-based economy led to a more stringent hold of the feudal lords over the production process and the labor needed to facilitate the process. With trade, there was an increasing necessity to produce for the market, and as such it reinforced the tendency to intensify the feudal pressure on the peasantry. Now, if we look at the manorial estate, which basically is a pure feudal system in which the peasants have no bargaining power, in this manorial estate, the economic surplus was basically appropriated by the landlords, and the system was completely dependent on the surplus labor time of the servile class, over and above what was necessary to provide for the latter's own subsistence. So whenever you wanted to go for an increase in the surplus, the agricultural laborers were exploited beyond measures. So if we look at this internal relationship of the feudal mode of production, that basically determined the disintegration of the entire system. And this is what exactly Dobbs tries to explain to us. And this explanation of Dobbs was also supported by Hilton. Now, it is important to put stress on feudal establishments here, who were very much in favor of trade, and they were willing participants in establishing and giving legitimacy to trade. The feudal urge to produce more for the market intensified the feudal pressures on the peasants, with the outcome that there was massive emigration. This form of emigration was widely seen in the 14th and 15th century England and other parts of continental Europe. Feudal production, as a result, faced a severe impact because of such wide-scale emigration of the peasants from the manorial estates, hampering the surplus appropriation by the feudal lords to a great extent. So to say it in very simple words, we can say that because of this excessive pressure of the feudal lords to extract surplus from the peasants, the only way out for the peasants was emigration. And this mass emigration from the manorial estates really hampered the appropriation of surplus by the feudal lords. Till now, I was talking about what was Dobbs' take on Marxism. And now we come to another very famous economist. His name is Paul Sweezy. He is another celebrated Marxian economist. And then there was Paul Barron of the Monthly Review. And these two were the first to contest Maurice Dobbs' viewpoint. Sweezy argued, what did Dobbs say? Dobbs said that the fall of feudalism was dependent on internal factors. Sweezy basically tries to refute that point of Dobbs. Sweezy argued that the collapse of feudalism could only be explained by factors which were arising from external the system and not from internal, as Dobbs had explained. And he rejected Dobbs' view of internal contradiction for the decline of feudalism. He emphasized on the growth of trade as the crucial factor accounting for the transition from feudalism to capitalism. According to Sweezy, feudalism is a system of production for use, and long-distance trade has no determining role in the objects and methods of its production, which catered to the producer's own consumption or to the markets which were for the most parts localized. So while Dobbs held that overexploitation of labor, unproductive use of the economic surplus, and exhaustion of power and opportunities to increase the landlord's revenue made the feudal mode increasingly untenable, Sweezy also tried to show how long-distance trade could be a creative force and can act as the key to the feudal ruling class's need for increased revenue in the latter Middle Ages. So here, we come to a very, very significant point. Basically, the point is creation of more revenue for the feudal lords. And they wanted to do that by putting pressure on the peasants so that they can extract as much of surplus as possible. That was Dobbs' theory. But Sweezy said that if we rely on international trade, it can act as a creative force that can be a key to the feudal ruling class of their objective of getting more and more revenue. And that really happened in the latter Middle Ages, which led to the disintegration of the feudal system. So Sweezy considered the following effects of an exchange economy to be sufficiently pervasive and powerful to ensure the breaking up of the pre-existing system of production. Number one, the inefficiency of the manorial organization of production was clearly revealed by the contrast with a more rational system of specialization and division of labor. Second, the very existence of exchange value as a massive economic fact tends to transform the attitude of the producers. Thirdly, the development of new tastes for consumption on the part of the feudal ruling class. And fourthly, the attraction of towns, which were the centers and the breeders of the exchange economy, for the survival population of the countryside. So here we see the rural-urban migration that took place in the westernized society to a huge extent. Now, Dobbs again rejected Sweezy's view that feudalism tended towards stagnation and insisted that it has its own momentum based on its internal, especially the class contradictions. Now, class conflicts between peasants and the landlords, this did not really directly lead to capitalism. What it did was, it lessened the dependence of the petty mode of production upon the feudal overlordship, eventually freeing the petty producers from feudal exploitation. Sweezy's notion of trade-driven external prime mover appeared to be simple single cause of explanation of the decline of the complex social system of feudalism. Admittedly, the exchange economy would not necessarily imply the end of either the serfdom or demesne firming. But the growth of towns as an alternative centers of employment impelled the lords to grant concessions and marking the elimination of the serfdom. Now, there was a long gap between the decline of feudalism in Western Europe during the 14th century and in the beginning of the capitalist period in the second half of the 16th century. Huge gap. So Sweezy does not agree with Dobbs' characterization of the intervening period. Now Dobbs calls this intervening period feudal, but Sweezy totally disagrees with it. He considers this period as a pre-capitalist commodity production period, or rather a transitional form in which the predominant elements were neither feudal nor capitalist in nature. Next objective of ours is to really understand the nature of the economy in the transition period. The transition period, with the decline of feudalism being set in motion with its own crisis in the 14th and the 15th centuries, caused by the peasants' resistance along with growing trade, leads the economy to pass through a transition. However, as we have already said, this cannot be viewed as an emergence of capitalism because this intervening period had not yet moved into a free-fold production of commodities, and the power of the lords over the production process and the peasants have not been completely eroded. So this period was an advanced stage of disintegration for feudalism. Christopher Hill also supports this view of Dobbs regarding the period of transition. He is of the opinion that Dobbs is correct in asserting that the partial emancipation from the petty mode of production does not in itself change the economic base of the society, although it does prepare the conditions for the development of capitalism. Sweezy does not support the characterization of this period into a still continuing feudal system. And Sweezy, as I have already said, prefers to call it the pre-capitalist mode of commodity production. And this transition basically paves the way for the rise of capitalism through the decline of feudalism, which we call the transition period. Now, lastly, we come to the concept of emergence and growth of capitalism. Now, with the growth of merchant capitalism due to the growth of trade, the merchants, they also started to enjoy political power. The ongoing nature of conflict between the petty producers and the privileged merchants was based on expanding the power of the absolutist state in England and Central Europe. Thus, the class struggle of the feudal society gets propelled to the next stage, and with the peasants' revolt in the feudal period, a new class emerged which were called the Kulak class. This also comprised of peasants, but they had been able to accumulate some capital, and so with that capital they were interested to bring more land under their production. This new class, undertaking more land for more production, they started to employ wage laborers and to earn more and more of surplus. So as trade grows, as merchants started increasing production, however, we find that the producer's ability to accumulate capital and to transform the petty mode of production into genuine capitalism, that was not very forthcoming. It was rather limited by unfair competition from guilds and mercantile monopolies, and also from lords who continued to collect rent under the protection of the feudal state. The situation in England was conducive to shift to production of industrial materials that paved the way for capitalism to emerge in England. Proletarialization of labor and the commercialization of land are the aspects of development of the capitalist world economy, while incorporation, that is addition of new geographic areas, is an integral part of the capitalist world development. That's how we saw colonies started to take place. So to conclude this, we can say that Marx, who noted in his chapter on primitive accumulation that what was fundamentally required for the development of capitalism was not the economic process of saving capital for investment, but rather for the creation of a new social context. In capitalist society, surplus value could be appropriated through the production of commodities because majority of the people were forced to commodify their labor power as a result of their complete separation from any rightful access to the necessary means of production, say land. So feudal social relations as a rule tied the producer to the soil through the direct domination of the social relations of lordship. As a result, where no historical process emerged specifically to dissolve the feudal agrarian social relations, but there was a continued evolution of class relations in social appropriation, and this tended not only to maintain the peasant upon the soil, but also to preserve the normative social regulation of peasant production, both through local customary laws and higher statutory authority. So the emergence of a particular economic system in recent times cannot be looked upon in isolation. Rather, it is an interplay of various complex and social factors that gives rise to a new social context, as Marx had already defined. Thank you.